Greetings and welcome to episode 66 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Today we are in the book of Esther. Now, Esther comes to us during the time of the Babylonian captivity. Remember how Daniel in the lion's den made friends with King Darius, who, after Daniel was let out of the lion's den, commanded that the whole Babylonian kingdom should believe in Daniel's God. Well, Esther takes place during that time, except Darius has died, and his son, wicked King Xerxes, 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 was now the king. And during the time of King Darius, there were three waves of people from Babylon who went back to Jerusalem. The first wave was led by Zerubbabel. I love that name. I don't know if I would have named I didn't know about the name Zerubbabel back when my kids were born, but Zerubbabel Burtness would have been a great name for one of my sons, although they probably would have disowned me. So Zerubbabel led the first wave. Ezra, we'll talk about him in the next episode, led the second wave, and Nehemiah led the third wave, which we'll talk about in episode 68. So before we get into that, let's talk for a moment about the Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Persian Empire. Back in the height of the Babylonian Empire, it spanned about 200,000 square miles from Iran to Turkey and even parts of Egypt. It was a massive empire with 127 provinces overseen by the king of Persia. We heard about King Darius of Persia, and King Xerxes was king who inherited his father's throne, but unfortunately he did not inherit his father's brain, because King Xerxes was kind of a dim-wit king. As we get into the story of Esther, it's important to remember four characters in the story of Esther, because it's kind of a confusing story. First of all, there's Xerxes, or King Xerxes, the indulgent and arrogant Persian king who's not so bright. He's kind of a dim-witted king. There's also Mordecai, a good guy, who is a shrewd mentor and uncle of Esther. Then there is Esther, the beautiful Jewish heroine who becomes King Xerxes' queen. Remember, King Xerxes was not a very bright man. And then there's Haman, the vain and vicious villain. So the story of Esther starts when King Xerxes, who's not very bright, inherited the powerful Persian king from his father, good King Darius. Now, King Xerxes was the kind of king you'd expect from someone who stumbled into wealth and fortune and status. He didn't know how to handle his newfound fame and fortune. King Xerxes loved parties and friends and beautiful women and hot cars and hot tubs and Cuban cigars. Young King Xerxes was immature, undeveloped emotionally, and besides that, he just wasn't too bright. Xerxes had a strong appetite and a weak ego. Shortly after he became king, he threw a party for some of the most influential people that he knew that lasted 7 days. An extravagant party. He pulled out all the stops with the best food and wine and entertainment. It was an extravagant, lavish party. During that party, King Xerxes, who had had his fill of the best Persian wine, asked his wife of the time, Queen Vashti, to come out and show everybody how beautiful she was to all of the important, influential people at the party. And he asked her to come out wearing nothing but her tiara, the crown on her head, otherwise buck naked. Well, did I say King Xerxes was not a very bright guy? His wife, Queen Vashti, realized that she was just being seen as an object to be gawked at, and she refused the request of her husband, the king, to come out. And that really ticked off King Xerxes. He thought that if she disgraced the king in such a public manner, no man in his kingdom would be safe from future disgrace. And so he had her banished from the empire. Like I said, King Xerxes wasn't too bright, and when he woke up the next morning, he sobered up and he thought, wait a minute, I don't have a queen to take care of me and make me my Egg McMuffin in the morning. And so, not being very bright, he came up with this amazing idea to have a beauty pageant with the most beautiful single women of the empire, and the prize of the beauty pageant would be him. Now, Esther was a young woman at the time who had been raised by her kind uncle Mordecai. They were Jewish, and they were among those who had been in captivity in Babylon. They weren't in the first wave of people who returned to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. And because Esther was so beautiful and she knew it and Mordecai knew it, Mordecai thought that she would be a shoo-in to win the beauty pageant and become the new queen of Persia. But because he knew that if King Xerxes found out that Esther was Jewish, he wouldn't even consider her, so Mordecai encouraged Esther not to tell anyone that she was Jewish. So, have you ever seen The Bachelorette on TV? Well, this was a 450 BC version of the same show. Same kind of thing. Needless to say, as fate would have it, or as God would have it, Esther won the pageant, and this young Jewish woman became the new queen of Persia over the Babylonian Empire. God has a sense of humor. Now, Haman was a vain and vicious villain, and Haman was one of the highest ranking officials of Persia. Because he was a vain and vicious villain, he convinced King Xerxes that everyone in town should bow down before him as he walked through town. Bowing down to King Xerxes was now the new law, and everybody bowed down except for Mordecai. Mordecai, you see, was Jewish, and his Jewish faith didn't allow him to bow down before anybody except God. And it bothered Haman no end. They'd walk around town and everybody bow down to him except Mordecai. So when Haman, the bad guy, the vain and vicious villain, discovered that Mordecai was Jewish, he hatched a sinister plan to have all of the Jewish people in the area killed. His anti-Semitism was rooted in his personal vendetta against Mordecai, who wouldn't bow down to the king. Haman went to King Xerxes, who, if you remember, wasn't too bright, and Haman told Xerxes that the Jews were a great political threat to Persia and something had to be done about them. Well, King Xerxes was just about to order a decree that all the Jews in the land would be killed, and when Mordecai heard of the plot, he sent word to Queen Esther, his niece, that she must go to the king right away and plead for her people, the Jewish people. Well, at first, Esther resisted. She reminded Mordecai that even though she was the queen, if she walked in on the king without permission, he could have her banished from the kingdom. Yes, she was beautiful and privileged, but she was also one who was reluctant to bring such a request to the king. She could lose her privilege, her standing, her place of prominence and promise. Esther was between a rock and a hard place. Even though she was one of God's chosen people, even though she was secretly Jewish to the king, she could have lost everything. Even though she was beautiful and privileged and the king adored her, she could lose it all. There seemed to be no good choices, no good options for her. But God had promised that God would be with us through anything we face. David had written long before her, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow. I'm going to fear no evil, for thou art with me. Years later, Jesus would say, you're going to have troubles, but have no fear. I am with you. So here's Esther deliberating about what she should do. She had comfort and status and privilege, yet she was being asked to go to the king and risk her life for the sake of her people. She could have thought, why didn't somebody else do it? Why is it up to me? I'm just not up to it. Leave me alone. It's not my responsibility. But Mordecai, her kind uncle, responded to her reluctance and says, you know what? Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time it is. And there it is, the key moment, the pivot point, the point at which your whole life turns one way or the other, dependent on the response that you make to the call of God on your life. The whole meaning of your life sometimes is a fulcrum point where it depends on how you respond to a single moment. Sometimes in life, there comes at least one or two times that make sense of all of the other moments of life. It's then you know why you are here and what you are to do. That was the moment for Esther. So the message of Esther is that God placed this woman at just the right moment, at just the right time. God called Esther at a specific place for a strategic purpose. 500 years later, God would place another young Jewish woman at a specific place for a strategic purpose in order to save God's people. That would be you and me from death. This time her name would be Mary, and the person she would bear would be Jesus, and the person she saved would be you. God places people at strategic places for specific purposes, and God continues to do that, and God works in our life even though we don't always see God at work. God is always at work, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes in front of the scenes, and sometimes we call things a coincidence. It just happens to happen, something randomly good happens. You're at the right place at the right time. The dictionary calls a coincidence a remarkable occurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. But what if coincidences in your life could rather be defined as a miracle for which God chooses to remain anonymous? What if coincidences in your life could be a miracle for which God chooses to remain anonymous? I mean, what if you started thinking about coincidences in that way? Think of it as a God incidence rather than a coincidence. A miracle for which God chooses to remain anonymous. Well, back to Esther. What happened to Esther? Well, you can read the story yourself in the book of Esther, and you'll find that through a series of dinners, she did go to the king, and the king did grant her request to save the Jews from annihilation. Because of Esther's intervention on God's behalf, God's promised people were saved. Because of Esther, you and I are here today. Because of Esther, we're given the example of someone who was able to thrive spiritually in a very difficult time, and through her strength, we can gain strength for difficult, challenging time. Now, there's two interesting things about the book of Esther. First is that the book of Esther is not referenced very much in Lutheran circles. Part of the reason is that it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God by name. Not even once. In fact, Martin Luther said of the book Esther, I am so great an enemy to Esther that I wish it had not come to us at all, for it has too many heathen unnaturalities. Unnaturalities, I think that's a word. But to untold generations of Jewish people, whether religious or secular or Orthodox or conservative, the book of Esther is one of the most familiar and beloved books of the Bible. Not because it's a book of doctrine or visions from God, but because it's a book of the ultimate Jewish success story. It is one that you cannot eradicate God's chosen people from the face of the earth. And the second thing about Esther is that when we wonder where God is sometimes in our lives, we're able to look back and see the activity, even though we might not be able to see it at the time. And sometimes, if you think God is silent or hidden in your life, remember Esther's story. Remember that the coincidences that we often experience in life could also be seen as God incidences, where there are miracles for which God chooses to remain anonymous. We walk by faith, not by sight. God's fingerprint, even though the name of God is not named in Esther, God's fingerprint is over the entire story, just like God's fingerprint is over our lives, even though we might not always see it. So remember that as we end episode 66, we'll talk about Ezra and then Nehemiah and continue the story, the episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Keep smiling. And until I see you again, you take care. Bye-bye.